are going to discuss this paper, as Dave Farnsworth said, that is 6 case studies in the implementation of revenue regulation in 6 different states. Now, we won't be talking about the concept of revenue regulation per se, but we do have a publication that talks about that, which is the second publication down on this slide. So if you want more background on the theory and practice and application of revenue regulation, look to that second publication as providing that kind of information. The publication that we are going to talk about is the one up above, number 7209, which is the 6 case studies in revenue regulation. And our thought on doing this was that there are many details in implementing a revenue regulation plan. And there's no right way to do it, and there's no wrong way to do it. But examining in some detail what these various states have done, I think should give the reader a background information and ideas on what kinds of features that they might want to put in a revenue regulation plan that they were designing for themselves. So that was our goal. Our goal is, another one of our goals is to get you to read the paper, obviously, but also to be aware of its content and be aware that it exists, and so you can use it as a reference materials if you were to go about designing or redesigning a revenue regulation plan. So next slide. So these are the 6 utilities, and they were chosen to represent a kind of a cross-section of types of utilities, areas of the country, vertically integrated, not vertically integrated, size, just to get a diversity of different types of utilities that we could look at and hopefully show some compare and contrast some of these features. So next slide, Deb. So as Dave mentioned, our webinar today will have an introduction, which we're pretty much finished with. Then we'll go through the features of the revenue regulation plans. That'll be the bulk of it. Then Janine will talk about some of the decision points that regulators and stakeholders working together need to wrestle with in order to come up with a revenue regulation plan that works for everyone. Questions, and then Janine will come back and talk about some of the top takeaways that we hope you've gotten from this webinar. So next slide. Now, these are all the topics that are covered in the paper, and this is kind of a teaser, again, to get you to read the paper. We're not going to talk about all of these. We're going to talk about a subset of these. And in the paper, we slice the subject matter both in several ways. We slice it by the utility and its individual revenue regulation plan. And we also slice it by these topics, and then compare and contrast each utility within the topic area. So there are a lot of topics, and think of these as kind of decision points of how a revenue regulation plan might be designed. These are kind of categories of things that you need to consider. So next slide, Janine. So the first topic that we're going to talk about is the actual revenue adjustment regulation in deregulation. So in the revenue regulation plan, there's a target revenue amount that's set in a rate case, essentially, and that's what the utility shoots for. But there may be reasons that the target revenue may want to change during the execution of the plan without requiring a full rate case. So there are several different methods to do that. One is called a stair-step type of increase, and this is calculated during a rate case where some costs might be known into the future and could be planned for in advance. So if you know there's going to be a particular capital expenditure, you might put a 1 or 2% increase in your capital expenditures and work that through the revenue regulation plan. There could be any number of things that are known in the future. You don't want to start collecting the revenues now, but you can adjust for those at some point in the future. You can also do some sort of an indexing, which would could be indexed to any number of indexes, such as inflation, productivity, customer growth, or some kind of changes in capital expenditures. So again, the idea here is to look at the expenditures, the rate case expenditures, and how those expenditures are presented, and to look at what changes might be anticipated in the future and include those in upfront. You can also do revenue per customer, and this can be separated from existing customers and new customers. So there can be an adjustment in the revenue amount based on the number of customers, existing and new, that would be, again, factored into the revenue regulation plan at its outset. You can also do a hybrid, which might be some combination of these. Certain costs could have an index, certain costs could have a stair step. And again, the idea is there would be some sort of an automatic or predetermined adjustment in the revenue amount as you go forward. Or you can have no ramp, and in that case, the utility is then required to come in for a rate case if they want to change their revenue amount. So those are some of the options. So next slide, Deb. So here's how our utilities shook out on the revenue adjustment mechanism and how they employed it. The Pacific Gas and Electric hybrid was, they had a stair-step type of a rate increase for certain costs, and then they had something for exogenous changes, and those can be things like tax laws or other things that may be unknown at the time but have a big impact on utility revenues and the need for revenue. The next three had a revenue per customer type of a revenue adjustment mechanism. National Grid had a capital expenditure adjustment. So what they would do is file a net of capital expenditures, net of depreciation. And then to the extent that that was larger, that would be added to the revenue requirement, and they could begin essentially collecting those revenues during the term of the revenue regulation mechanism. Hawaii has a pretty complex, we call it hybrid here, but it's actually fairly complex. They have essentially four categories of adjustments: one to base expenses, one to rate base, there's an exogenous change, and then they have an earnings sharing revenue credit, which I'll talk a little bit about. So for the base expenses, they separate into labor and non-labor. They have a productivity adjustment to the labor costs, and each of these labor and non-labor cost categories are escalated at different rates. So this is gets to be a little bit complex. They also have a rate-based adjustment that is adjusted for, that it itself is adjusted for four things: depreciation, capital expenditures, aid to construction, and different forms of taxes. So again, these can get somewhat complex. And they also have an exogenous change, like I said before, that can be something like tax laws. And they have an earnings sharing revenue credit. And this is an interesting feature in that if the utility earns more revenue by, and it's kind of a sliding scale, so if they earn 300 or 500 basis points more in revenue, that is shared either 50% or 90% with customers. So there's a way then to limit the amount of revenue that the utility might collect overall above what it needs to maintain its paying for its capital expenditures. Okay, next slide, Jeff. Another feature that can be adjusted or that can be tweaked in a revenue regulation plan is what customer classes can be included. So you don't necessarily have to include all the customer classes. So as you can see, 4 of our utilities that we looked at did include all customer classes. The 2 included only residential and small general service categories. So this is another area that you can, in thinking about designing a revenue regulation plan, another area that can be subject to a decision, and you can do different things. Sometimes industrial customers don't like a revenue regulation scheme. They like to have a rate case. They like to participate in rate cases. They'd like to see the information to see what the costs are. So regulator can choose to include or exclude kind of a subset of customers. The only downside to this is that you need some sort of a cost of service study then to, at the beginning, to then allocate costs to each of these different categories of customers. So next slide, Deb. And you can exclude or include customer classes, and then you can include or exclude utility functions. So, and this isn't to say that there may not be other fuel adjustment clauses or purchase power trackers or any energy efficiency riders that may be available and included in the overall rate scheme of the utility that may be used to collect and adjust for variations in some of these costs, but it's not part of the revenue regulation plan. So mostly these utilities have excluded variable costs, energy costs, by and large, are excluded from the revenue regulation plan, although most, if not all, have some sort of a purchase power adjustment clause to make up any differences or shortfalls in the collection of these costs. So I think here I turn it over to Janine.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, so we're going to talk now about rate adjustment mechanisms. So the first category under that is the rate case requirements. Regulators and stakeholders view rate cases as an important opportunity to align costs with revenues and rates. Surcharges reduce the need for rate cases because they allow recovery of a variety of costs more contemporaneously, but they may not capture cost increases or decreases in base rates. So even if there are inflation adjustments included in a revenue regulation mechanism, it may not capture all the changes in rates. So some states, therefore, have decided that periodic rate cases to examine the appropriateness of the revenue requirements and determine subsequent rates are important. And what you will see here is that a few of the states have no such requirement, whereas Pacific Gas and Electric, for example, requires a rate case every 3 years with an annual attrition adjustment in between, and HECO has a abbreviated annual rate case, and Wisconsin does a full rate case. So the bottom line here is that different states have and different utilities have treated this issue differently in terms of how frequently they feel they need to adjust rates, and it may also be in part a function of the number of surcharges they have in place for automatic recovery. Next slide, please. So in terms of the collection mechanism for the revenue regulation, this slide shows how frequently decoupling rate adjustments have been made. Adjustments can range from monthly to annually, with the most common being annually. BG&E was the only utility we looked at that actually adjusted rates monthly. And in looking at that, we saw large swings in the amount of the adjustment up and down. And so when you have an annual adjustment, you probably have less rate volatility because the highs and lows get averaged out into an annual amount. But on the other hand, a monthly mechanism is going to be more accurate as to what the actual cost is at that time. And as you'll see later on, that has implications when you get into the issue of carrying charges. Next slide, please. One of the important questions is, a revenue regulation usually is designed to allow utilities to recover any revenue deficiencies. But the flip side of the coin is, should customers get credited if there is over-recovery of revenues? And all 6 of these utilities studied did use a symmetrical approach, which RAP recommends, which allows for both over and under recoveries. And most of these adjustments are done on a customer class basis. So that was the second decision point. Do you just average it out among all customers, or do you look at it from a customer class basis, which is probably a more accurate way to do it, and that's how these utilities were doing that. Next slide, please. The other issue is carrying charges. If you're going to have an annual adjustment, or in the event that you don't recover all of the cost in one year because of a rate cap and you carry it over to a subsequent year, should there be a carrying charges? Pacific Gas and Electric has none, nor does Baltimore Gas and Electric, but because Baltimore Gas and Electric has a contemporaneous recovery of decoupling of revenue amounts every month, it would not be needed. For the other utilities that do it on an annual basis, they basically based it on short-term debt or the customer charge. And the customer deposit rate for one of the utilities is 6%, which is also close to the short-term cost of debt. So the adjustments where the carrying costs where they are applied are pretty similar across the utilities we looked at. Next slide, please. Another important issue is the cap on rate adjustments. Are there any caps? This is something that consumer advocates frequently are comfortable with or would like, because it limits the amount of exposure for customers in the event of significant revenue shortfalls on the part of the utility and what those revenue shortfalls can do to customers' rates. So so a cap kind of reflects a controlled way to manage customer expectations and customer impacts. And typically, when a rate cap is imposed, if the formulaic increase exceeds the cap or collar, the utility will be able to carry over any uncollected revenues until the next rate adjustment. Two of the utilities studied, PG&E and HECO, do not have rate caps. Others have caps based on percentage of rate increase or a hard dollar amount. But note that National Grid differs from Baltimore Gas and Electric and Hawaiian Electric Company in that its cap is based on revenues, whereas the other two, it's based on rates and rate impacts. A revenue cap is more focused on ensuring minimal change to the revenue requirements authorized by the Commission. National Grid, as discussed previously, allows for mini rate cases to adjust the revenue requirements. If we could go to the next slide. I like this slide because it's a good way to illustrate, well, what are going to be the impacts of revenue regulation on customer rates. And this slide basically shows both the impacts in terms of surcharges and refunds. And the range of rate impacts cluster around plus or minus 2%, but can at times exceed plus or minus 5%. But that's pretty infrequent. For many ratepayer advocates, there is concern about this issue, and this is a good way to demonstrate how this will impact customer rates. However, the utility retains management risk and the requirement to demonstrate that it has acted prudently, even if it's getting its full revenues back. Where utilities do not come in for rate cases for long periods of time, a decoupling mechanism is a way to ensure that customers are not overpaying due to excess earnings, because there is this reconciliation every year. On the other hand, a decoupling mechanism also provides a greater level of assurance that the utility will recover their revenue requirements, which is important to the shareholders. Next slide. So now I'm going to discuss complementary policies that often are accompanied or interact with revenue regulation. And the next 4 slides are going to discuss these policies, and then the 5th slide will show how each of these 6 utilities studied shake out with respect to these policies. So the first policy is energy efficiency. Very often energy efficiency is the revenue regulation is the quid pro quo for energy efficiency. You're not willing to do energy efficiency, you don't get the revenue regulation. That's the viewpoint that's taken by some parties, and it's sort of the raison d'etre, if you will, is because you want to make sure that if a utility engages in comprehensive energy efficiency and they have lost revenues, they are made whole. So that brings them both together in a sort of a complementary way. And states have varying levels of energy efficiency requirements that could be determined by the legislatures or the courts or the commissions. Decoupling basically, as has been stated earlier, removes the throughput incentive that has always been the barrier for utilities engaging in comprehensive energy efficiency. Next slide, please. In terms of incentive structures, while revenue regulation allows the utility to recover lost revenues, it doesn't provide any kind of incentives. When a utility is looking at their resource options, they may look at building a power plant and see that they can earn a rate of return on their capital investments, whereas with energy efficiency, they may not do that. So a lot of states have adopted incentive structures that will help incentivize management to aggressively pursue energy efficiency, and it can help be sort of a game changer by changing the culture of the company to see that this could be a revenue source for them and provide them with more of an incentive to actively engage in energy efficiency. And especially, we could go into a whole lot on incentive structures, which we're not going to do, which is not the subject here, but incentives that increase with the amount of over compliance with standards gives utilities a greater incentive to do more. So go to the next slide. Rate design is also a very important issue in terms of price signals that it can send customers regarding conservation. With inclining rates, customers engaged in energy efficiency can save by staying in the lower tier, in the lower usage tier. So if your lowest usage tier is somewhere around 600 kWh, for example, and you've engaged in energy efficiency and been able to cut your usage back, you can save money. And if you're over, the amount of higher rate that you're going to pay is going to be less. On the other hand, if you do a declining block rate structure, that discourages conservation by providing lower rates in the second and third tier. So you have less of an incentive to save once you've exceeded that first tier of usage. And it sort of acts a bit like a bulk discount. Next slide, please. Performance incentives are also important because they can send policy messages to utilities and can be used to reward behavior that is consistent with the policy directions of the state. So whatever that policy directive is that the state wants the utility to engage in, you can use performance incentives in that way. And taking a more global look at it, all regulation is about what are you incenting, what signals are you sending to utilities, what are you incenting them to do or not do, and how have you structured recovery and the opportunity to gain revenue. How is that being structured? So performance incentives can be used sometimes to reward utilities for not cutting services and reliability in order to increase their margins. So those are usually very important, attributes. You want reliable service for customers. You don't want to have outages. And it can also be used to complement decoupling by providing utilities greater assurance of recovering revenues while they still provide the reliable service. The next slide. So in this next slide, what we're looking at is, well, how did each of these utilities stack up with regard to these various complementary policies? And I'll just point out a few things here. One is that Idaho Power and Light sets its standards in its IRP, and the spending for energy efficiency has been increasing annually. 3 of the utilities studied had no incentive mechanism, while for HECO, any incentive that they do get goes to the third-party administrator. None of the utilities studied here use a declining block, and most have inclining blocks. Many also offer optional time-of-use rates. And only National Grid has a performance incentive, while 2 others, Hawaiian Electric Company and Baltimore Gas and Electric, have taken first steps by requiring reporting, and others have it under consideration. So we may be seeing more of these with the utilities down the road. Next slide, please. So one of the important things that we looked at overall that sort of came out from this entire study is the realization that there are multiple decision points when you design revenue regulation mechanism And there's a lot of flexibility as to how to do it and what you want to include or not include. And it can vary by utility, it can vary by state. So, excuse me, some of the decision points are, for example, should revenue regulation apply to all functions? If you're a deregulated utility, most likely it's only going to apply to your distribution function. If you're vertically integrated, are you going to apply it to generation, transmission, and distribution, all three of those services? Should a revenue regulation apply to all customer classes? Note that with the residential class, there's more uniformity in terms of usage than there is with the industrial class, where you have different sizes of load and demand on the system, which makes decoupling more challenging, but certainly not impossible to do. So that is another decision point. And then finally, on this slide, should there be symmetry such that reconciliation adjustments occur for over and under recoveries? And I would say that for customer groups especially, that would be an important component to have. And as we saw earlier, all of the utilities that we studied did have that. Next slide, please. So another decision point should recovery of indicated surcharges be conditioned to unacceptable performance on customer service quality or energy efficiency goals. This helps keep the utility focused on efficient delivery of reliable service by having those things. Should there be an attrition adjustment to account for other expenses or other revenue regulation adjustments? Or should there be an inflation adjustment? Different kinds of adjustments that can have the impact of raising rates might be viewed by some consumer advocates with some skepticism, but utilities see it as an efficient way to address some of the categories of rising costs and keeping them whole and keeping them from having to come in with frequent rate cases. So that ties back with how often under the regulatory process you have in place do you have a review of rates. Next slide, please. Should the adjustments be made in rate cases or through a rider? And that again is another issue as to whether or not you're going to have riders, whether or not you're going to do a rider which is like an extra surcharge on customer bills, or whether you want to somehow have that rider have those adjustments put into base rates, which can be done where you're having annual rate cases. How frequently should the adjustments be made? Monthly, annually, or some other period of time? You can design it for as much accuracy or as much as you want, or to minimize volatility. Those are various decision points that need to be made. And depending upon the time period between true-up and recovery, should there be carrying charges? And if so, how should they be calculated? That's yet another decision in terms of how you want to structure this. In the carrying charge issue, should it flow both ways, so that if the utility has to credit customers, does the customer also get the value of a carrying charge as well? Next slide. Should there be a requirement authorizing the frequency of rate cases? And again, this would tie back to how what adjustments you're allowing within your revenue regulation mechanism as to how often you think there might be a need for a rate case. Frequent rate cases can check for decreased costs and can also better balance cost increases and decreases. Should there be an annual cap on the opportunity to an annual cap on the amount of the adjustment, and if so, should there be an opportunity to carry over any additional amounts, and for how many years? This again, some regulators may say, well, we have a cap of 3%, and if you exceed that, that's in either direction, that's it. That's a risk. Or some may allow for carryover for a period of 1, 2, or 3 years. If in the next year, for example, it was a 2% over recover, and you can take and then you can take it out to 3% to recover what you didn't recover the year before. And then again, there's the issue of the carrying charges, how you address that. And finally, should there be an adjustment to the cost of capital to reflect the reduced risk? This is something that some consumer advocates argue, that since the utility has the risk for the utility not recovering their revenue requirements has decreased, that should be reflected in their return on equity to lower the return on equity. So, you know, that's something that utilities often oppose. One thing we have noted, we tried to find data on, you know, what impact does revenue regulation have on bond ratings and, you know, the view from Wall Street. And because of the size of utilities and the fact that they're part of holding companies with, you know, many other utilities, you know, maybe many other sister utilities, and there are a whole lot of issues that are factored in, it's difficult to say, well, revenue regulation, you know, there was, you know, revenue regulation had an absolute impact, but we do note that there have been notations by Standard & Poor and others noting that having revenue regulation is a positive for the utility. And so with that, next slide. We are ready for questions.
Thank you very much, Janine. That was great. Thank you, Dave. I've got a question that could go to both of you. Janine, I'll ask you to answer, give you a shot first, and Dave, please jump in. Jenny Heaters asked whether or not you're aware of any research on the level of lost revenue and shareholder incentives paid to utilities for efficiency programs throughout the U.S.
I don't have any aggregate data on how much that would be, or what it would be. A calculation that would be done on a utility by utility basis. If you go back to the slide on lost revenues, the slide that shows the chart going back, keep back. There, you know, you can see what the percentages were, which for each utility would translate into different revenue amounts, and I suppose you could total that up on a utility by utility basis, or, you know, try to do some sort of aggregate analysis. And the same goes for incentives, because the incentive mechanisms vary from state to state. But I think one of the points is this, you know, and I'm going to interject a little editorial comment here as a former consumer counsel, that even when you add in the program costs, the lost revenues, and incentive payments, energy efficiency still turns out to be a least cost option, less costly than supply side resources. So having these costs paid by customers should not be a deterrent to proceeding with energy efficiency.
And so I am not aware of any place where some of this information has been compiled, except for, as Janine pointed out, here. So, sorry.
Is there another question?
I beg your pardon. I should unmute my phone. Thanks. Should regulators have a preference for the specific manner in which a rate cap is formulated, in which it's fashioned? In other words, a percentage base or a fixed amount?
Most of the utilities went with a percentage as opposed to a fixed amount. If we go to this slide, I believe there was one utility that had a, there was one utility that did actually do a hard dollar amount, which, you know, then can be translated back into, you know, a percentage amount. So right there, that's the slide. Thank you. So Wisconsin Power Public Service did a cap of 14 million, whereas the others mostly did percentages. And so there's no right or wrong here. It's really a question of how the Commission wants to determine this.
And I think, like, for instance, in the case of National Grid, they were looking to expand their distribution network. And so they knew that they were going to have additions in capital expenditures, so there was a specific provision in the plan to account for anticipated increases in capital expenditures, whose timing was somewhat uncertain. So in some ways, the form should follow the function, or the function should follow the form, depending on what your goal is and if there are specific concerns that you're trying to address.
Thanks, David. Well, so while we're still in Wisconsin here, can the speakers comment on utility fixed charges and their relationship to these alternative revenue regulation systems that were studied? In Wisconsin, we're seeing nearly all the utilities in the state attempting to raise fixed charges quite dramatically in some cases.
Well, fixed charges will have an adverse impact on energy efficiency. There was a slide on complementary policies where we talked about the various kinds of rate designs, and in that slide we talked about how declining block does not send the proper price signals for conservation. Straight fixed variable, or these high fixed charge costs, will have an even greater adverse impact on the benefits of energy efficiency and for customers to engage in it, because it will do a number of things. It's sort of an all-you-can-eat rate, and it will do a number of things. Like, number one, it will increase the payback period for any customer that invests in energy efficiency. It will also decrease the savings on any actual bill savings per month on their bills for energy efficiency. And then another impact that I think has a lot of consumer advocates concerned is the fact that you have people living in a small, let's say a one-bedroom home paying the same amount as somebody living in a 5-bedroom, 5-bathroom, cathedral ceiling household who's probably got 5 flat screen TVs versus 1, and a whole lot more gadgets, and they're both paying the same fixed charges. So that's really a concern in terms of getting customers to go and do energy efficiency in the first place, which then leads to the need for some kind of revenue regulation mechanism.
It also seems to me that as to the extent that you have higher fixed costs, and I think Janine is right that we don't think that's a good idea for all the reasons that she stated, but it also would lessen the need for a revenue regulation plan. If all of your, or a greater portion of your revenues are collected through a fixed charge, then you may not need, you'll have less need for a revenue regulation plan to cover essentially the variable costs or the variable revenue collection that you would get from changing amounts of sales.
Thank you. Question from Jeff Ford. I understand how these rate structures can properly incent energy efficiency. Are there similar structures for renewable energy? In many ways, renewables, particularly net metered renewables, impact utilities in a similar way to energy efficiency. Can performance incentives be structured to encourage renewables?
Yes.
Go ahead, Dave.
I think you're seeing some of that in the New York REV process, in which they're looking at different ways to provide incentives to their utilities that doesn't necessarily follow directly, or that tries to motivate them to do and implement the policies of essentially New York State. So they're trying to create a situation where the utilities provide a platform for customers to be empowered to do whatever they want. If they want to do efficiency, great. If they want to do renewables, that's fine. And they're still working on how to do this, but there would be an incentive structure developed that would incent the utility to accomplish these policy objectives. So I don't know if there's any in existence yet at this point, but I think there are states that are working on it.
And I would add to that's the concept behind performance management regulation where you can, incentive regulation where you set forth the goals for the utility of what you want them to achieve, and you reward them for achieving those goals. So if encouraging more renewable energy is a goal, you can design a performance mechanism that measures that and rewards the utility for achieving that. I would also note that, as you have more PV and other technologies, renewable energy on the grid, that those too are eroding the revenues for the utility companies. And so revenue regulation plays an important role for those technologies as well.
Thank you. Goodwin Thompson has a question related to the one you folks just addressed. Could you talk about decoupling as a solution to the quote-unquote utility death spiral threat of distributed generation?
Well, decoupling, as I just said, decoupling is certainly a tool in the toolbox to try to levelize the utilities' revenues, but at some point where you have a very significant drop in utility revenues because of the proliferation of PV, for example. Revenue decoupling probably will not be sufficient in and of itself because revenue decoupling focuses on volumetric charges, so those charges would go to those customers who are not participating in any of these programs. So we need to, while it is an important tool in the toolbox and needs to be addressed and used for those purposes, after you probably get to a certain threshold, we'll probably need to look at other mechanisms as well.
Thanks, Janine. About how many states have adopted some form of electric revenue regulation?
I believe that there are, I don't have the exact number offhand, but I believe that almost, I'd say maybe about a third of them have, and it may not be all of the utilities in that particular state. It may be one or two. Not all states are uniform in their application of this, and I have a slide on this on another PowerPoint presentation that breaks that down. So maybe somehow we can make that available afterwards.
Okay. David Nemstow said he likes your list of decision points and asks, isn't there a trade-off between precision, which is good, and offering decoupling to discourage efficiency, also good? Can we shorten the decision point list to those most impactful?
I'm not sure I fully get the question, but if you're going, I think each of those decision points are at some point as you're sitting there as a regulator and you're working your way through and you're trying to decide how you do it, you're going to have to come to decisions on each one of these points. I don't know how you necessarily avoid those. And then there may be other decision points that I have not listed. I took the major ones.
On the other hand, these revenue regulation schemes do tend to evolve. So they may not have every single feature to start with, but they can be added as you go along.
Thank you. Christina Gosnell wants to know, what is the justification for using future test years?
Well, I think that that's something that utilities like to do, because by the time you get through the rate case, when you use a historical test year, it may not be fully reflective of what the costs are going to be, and the future test year, if done well with good economic modeling on what future costs will be a more accurate window of where costs will be. Then again, if you do a future test year, that's going to increase the revenue requirements, and that's going to have an impact on the decoupling mechanism and may actually reduce the amount of adjustments that are potentially needed.
Okay. What's the difference between decoupling and straight fixed variable rates. Can decoupling address or be combined with another policy to address the cross-subsidy issues with net metering?
These are decoupling and net metering, decoupling and straight fixed variable are similar in that they both address the throughput incentive and that the utility will recover its revenues. But they're very dissimilar in how they go about doing that and how they address conservation and providing customers incentives to engage in energy efficiency. Remember that the threshold reason in many instances for doing revenue regulation was in order to make utilities whole for engaging in energy efficiency. So if you change a rate structure such that you no longer have those incentives, you no longer provide price incentives, that becomes an issue. So I think decoupling is a much more accurate way to reflect what the costs are and to provide customers with the benefits of engaging in energy efficiency than straight fixed variable. The thing that I've always said about straight fixed variable, it's sort of, with decoupling, you set the revenue requirements and the utility comes in and they say, here's what I actually recovered and here's, what I was supposed to recover, so either give me the difference or I'll refund it back. With straight fixed variable, in my consumer advocacy days, I described that as you take the money and run. If the utility is over-recovering, you never see those revenues refunded back to customers. So I see decoupling as a much more precise and better way to address costs. And as to net metering, I think we need to look at other rate design and regulatory mechanisms to address the whole issue that's been surfacing in discussions recently about, what is the impact of net metering on customers. On the have-not customers.
Okay. Carol Cron has written, when Janine said that the cost of DSM, even including loss margin recovery and shareholder incentives, is less than the cost of adding supply-side resources, what cost per kilowatt hour or kilowatt are you assuming for new plant costs? Is the assumed cost of new plant greater than 30 cents per kilowatt hour?
Basically what I was relying on for that, and we don't have a slide on it here, but again I have this in another PowerPoint, is a slide that was prepared by Lazard Brothers that shows what are the costs of the various resource options, and it's done on a dollar per kilowatt basis where it lines up energy efficiency with solar, wind, gas, coal, and nuclear. And if you look at those, if you take a look at that, and maybe that's something we can also make available afterwards, you'll see that the cost of energy efficiency is significantly lower.
I guess I would add to that, by definition, energy efficiency programs generally have to pass a cost-effectiveness test, which essentially says that their cost is less than the alternatives. So, I think just by definition, they're less cost-effective. And I know when we looked at the levelized cost of energy efficiency in Vermont, which is the state I'm most familiar with, it was somewhere around the 3 to 3.5 cents range. And my second comment would be that the loss margins are not really a cost of energy efficiency. I don't think it's fair to lump those into the energy efficiency costs because they really are costs that the utility should have recovered under their normal rate making, but didn't because they did energy efficiency. But they're legitimate costs that should be recovered.
Okay, thank you. So we're kind of getting into the lightning round part of this Q&A. We have enough time for 2 or 3 more questions. Nancy LaPlaca has asked, as utility growth rates stall, how will this affect decoupling?
I think, as utility growth rates stall, whatever the revenue requirement is that was established by the Commission, this will give the utility a better opportunity to recover those lost revenues. So revenue regulation could be very helpful to utilities under those circumstances, and will help ensure that we have they have the revenues needed to ensure grid reliability.
I would think whatever it causes utility sales to decrease, I think would give the utilities more incentives to pursue a revenue regulation plan.
Okay. Are there any studies that look at the measured impact of decoupling on energy efficiency and sales to customers?
I'm not aware of any offhand. There is, Pamela Lesh did a very thorough analysis about a year or two ago, and I believe we have referenced her in our whole report in terms of where she looked at all of the different utilities and how they and just did sort of like a survey overview. So there might be something in there, but I'm not sure.
Carol Crone has asked, what cost test is most frequently used? Isn't RIM the only one that really looks at ratepayer impact?
Well, RIM looks at ratepayer impact, but RIM is not a preferred mechanism. The most commonly used mechanism is the total resource cost test, where you look at all the costs and all the benefits, and if the benefits exceed the costs, then the program would pass. There are also other programs. The utility cost test is another test that has been used, and sometimes what regulators will do is they'll look at several tests at once to sort of get a full picture of how a program measures up. So they may look at RIM, but RIM may not be the deciding factor. The total resource cost test most frequently is. Dave, do you want to add anything on that?
No, I think you're right.
Carol has another question. Are shareholder performance incentives for DSM programs typically based on net energy savings, in other words, savings after EM&V, or gross savings? Utilities want to reward their completion of a certain confirmed number of measures rather than rewarding net energy savings from DSM. Is that a reasonable position?
Well, I don't know if there's been any studies of that or any summary statistics. All I can say is from my experience in one state, we did it on post-evaluation savings.
Okay.
And again, I would add that this is a decision point for commissions, and that there have been a number of discussions about this. Recently at the ACEEE conference, there were discussions that touched on this, and I think different states and different utilities do it differently between gross versus net.
Okay. If a listener is interested in pursuing revenue regulation policy in their state, what's the first step you recommend they take?
Well, it depends upon whether the stakeholder is a utility, a consumer advocate, or a commission person, is a commission staffer. But I think the first thing to do is perhaps convene all of the stakeholders together and have an informal workshop or discussion where the various lost revenue mechanisms can be discussed in detail, and also, focusing on revenue regulation and what are the decision points and how would you like to see it designed. I think sometimes if you can start with an informal route, that can work well. If you're a commission, in a commission, you can maybe initiate a proceeding and put together a straw proposal for parties to comment on. If you're a utility, you can file for that. And if you're a different kind of stakeholder, you could also file with the commission and ask them to open an investigation. So those are a number of the different ways that you could get started on that, depending upon what kind of a stakeholder you are.
The other thing is frequently the revenue regulation plans require legislation. So I think another thing to do would be to check the legal status of what, if a revenue regulation plan were adopted by the commission, pass legal muster.
But the other thing I would add to that also is that a lot of utilities also take a look at what are the general powers and authority of the commission, because very often under the general power and authority of the commission will have the ability to do that. There are a few states which have explicitly stated you can or cannot do decoupling. One, I think Pennsylvania does not allow it, but that's the only state I know of that has explicitly stated that. But most states, in working with some of the commissions in the past, I would start with, if there's no explicit language on decoupling, take a look at their general supervisory powers and see if they can cover it and see if it can be covered there.
Very good. Well, listen, thank you for that. So we've reached the end of the Q&A session. Janine, you've got a couple minutes to summarize. Why don't you go ahead with that?
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Dave. So one of the things we try to look at in this is how do you measure the success of revenue regulation? You know, there's a lot of controversy around revenue regulation. Should we do it or shouldn't we? And I think overall, you know, revenue regulation is a very fine tool for addressing lost revenues. So some of the things that you can look at to determine whether or not whether it's successful is if the utility is no longer concerned about increases and decreases in sales. Are they no longer taking action to increase sales or reduce any decreases in sales? And what about the efficiency of their operations and management? Has that been improving as they're able to focus on different things? And then also, very importantly, has this resulted in a change in the utility culture to be more supportive of energy efficiency and to embrace it and to get excited and really want to do it? I mean, ultimately, that's what you want to accomplish, because if someone has to do something, they'll do, and they don't want to do it, they'll do it, and they'll do it to merely comply. If they're excited about it, you know, human nature says they'll go above and beyond, and that's what we really want to see. So that's one of the measures of success. Next slide, please. The other measures of success are acceptance by stakeholders after it's been implemented and had a little bit of, you know, a couple of years to operate. Are regulators hearing back from stakeholders that they don't like it, that it's not working, that it needs to be changed? What have been the actual impacts on rates from the revenue regulation mechanism? What has been the ability, looking at the ability and activity of the utility to focus on energy efficiency and thereby provide customers with lower cost options and better customer interactions. Remember one CEO telling me about how, as a result of implementing their energy efficiency program, the local newspaper did a big story on this utility and what they were doing, and the CEO said, "That's the best news. That's the best positive coverage I've ever gotten." So, you know, there are positives that come out of it. What also is the view by financial institutions? Again, we talked earlier about Standard & Poor's and what they had to say generally. And is energy efficiency and distributed resources in that service territory increasing because the utility is no longer concerned about the reduction in sales? So these are some of the measures of success once you've implemented a deregulation, revenue regulation program. So those were sort of some of our conclusions.
Great, Janine. Well, thank you very much. And Dave, thank you as well. That was a terrific presentation. Listeners on the line, if you have further questions, I'm sure that Janine and Dave would be happy to get an email from you and to follow up with the discussion. But at this point, I think we've run our hour, and I want to thank you all for participating. Have a great afternoon. Bye now.